Today we're going to take a look at meat as an ingredient. Now we've learned plenty of techniques already. If you'll recall, we've sautéed a chicken breast, we've made a pot roast of beef, and we even made a lamb stew. But let me ask you this question. Have you ever gone to the store and wondered what the difference is between heritage pork and the pork you find in the supermarket? Or how about grading of beef? That can get confusing. Is prime the good stuff or is choice the good stuff? And then with chicken, is it okay to roast a small chicken or should I roast a large chicken? Is 6 pounds too big? Is 1.5 pounds too small? You've probably all got plenty of strategies for buying meat. Some of you spend as much money as you can afford and get the best meat that you can afford. Others just look for the bargains. The real answers probably lie tangled between those two extremes, and I'm hoping that today we can clear up some of those questions and make you a more informed consumer. So let's get started. I've got a chicken right here. This is a Poussin, a very small chicken. Now, as a rule of thumb, an older animal has more flavor than a younger animal, and an older animal has more fat than a younger animal. So this is a very young chicken. Its flavor is going to be mild, and I'm going to cook it so that it gets a lot of browning and season it assertively and serve it with a salad that has a lot of flavor. We've already roasted a chicken and it took us about 1.5 hours, maybe 1.25 hours. I want to show you a way that we can roast this chicken very, very quickly. I'm going to do something called spatchcocking this chicken. That's what they call it in England. In France, they call it chicken crépodine. What I'm going to do is cut the spine out of this bird. So here's the breast, the 2 legs and the wings. I'm going to flip it over. There's the neck. And I'm going to cut on either side of the neck with a pair of poultry shears and just cut the spine right out of this chicken. There's a little bit of extra skin here that I'm not going to need. I'll take that and get rid of it. Now I can open this bird up and I'm looking at the inside of the keel bone or the inside of the breastbone. I'm going to take my knife and cut the cartilage closest to the wings, just like that, and then glide my knife just over the top of that bone. And if I bend it back, what you'll see happening is the keel bone will almost pop out. And you just get in here and peel it away, and the bone broke into 2 pieces, and I'll tell you why. This portion of the bone right here has already calcified. It feels like a bone. This portion right here is still cartilage. As this chicken gets older, those 2 pieces will fuse together, and the whole thing will stop being cartilage and start becoming bone. This is an indication of how young this bird is. With the breastbone out, take a look. This chicken lays nice and flat. And if I was roasting it, it would take a long time to cook, but because I'm going to roast it flat like this, it should cook very quickly. I'm going to take the wings and trim those off as well at what I call the elbow. So here is what would be the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, and that is the hand. There's a sweet spot at the joint, and I cut right through there, and that comes out. That is a spatchcocked chicken, and I'm going to cook it skin side down. I'm even going to put a brick on top of it to weight it down against the pan so that the skin gets nice and golden and crispy. I've got a pan that's pretty hot already. I'm going to turn it up nice and high. I've got a brick here that I covered with foil, and I've had it in the oven for a while at 475 degrees, so it's hot already too. While we wait for the pan to heat up, I'm going to season this chicken with salt and a little bit of pepper. We'll flip it over. More salt, a little bit of pepper, and I'm going to put just a splash of oil there and the balance in the pan. I'll just rub this oil into the chicken. And as I look at this, the thickness is such that I anticipate maybe 20 minutes, probably closer to 18. It's going to cook very, very quickly. So It's not going to be in the oven for a long time, so the oven needs to be turned up pretty high. If I want to get browning, because it's not going to be in there for very long, high temperature. I'm thinking 475, 500 degrees. So I'm just starting to see a little bit of smoke coming off of this oil. That means the oil is as hot as I can get it without it breaking down. I'm going to take this chicken and I want to put it into the pan skin side down. That sizzle is a good sound. Now, we're going to leave it on this side until I get nice grill marks from the ridges in this grill pan. It should only take a minute or two. All right, let's take a look at this bird. As you can see, there's some nice color beginning to develop on this bird. I'm going to turn it 90 degrees. And so that it stays in close contact, I have this brick that I have wrapped in foil, and I put it in the oven. It's pretty hot, and I'm going to put that right on top of the chicken to hold the skin in close contact with the pan below. This is going to go into the oven at about 500 degrees. And it shouldn't take more than 15 to 18 minutes. Okay, we're about 20 minutes in on this chicken. Let me take the brick off and we'll see what we've got. It's not a very large bird, and so I could serve this as a portion, but more realistically, I think if I cut it in half, right where the keel bone used to be, and then think about separating the leg from the breast, and move that over to the salad. I'm going to take this leg, we'll put that on there as well. In just 20 minutes, using the technique of spatchcocking, I have a meal ready to go on the table. That's a great technique. Pork is the other white meat. Since about the 1980s, they've been breeding pork leaner and leaner so it can compete with chicken breast. Now, they've done a pretty good job. Pork is a fairly lean cut of meat. That can be a problem in the kitchen because when you cook a very lean meat, it can dry out unless you're really on your game. Recently, heritage pork started to reappear, and you ask yourself what that's all about. Well, pork is not graded the way beef is graded. It's not graded prime or choice, and so consumers have no way of understanding pork and what quality looks like in pork. And with nothing really to hold on to, they're grasping at heritage pork as an indicator of quality. Heritage pork typically grows more slowly and likely puts on more fat, and it's entirely possible that it tastes better, but it also costs a lot more. So what can we do with the pork that we buy from the supermarket? Well, I'm going to show you how to make a brine today. And a brine is nothing more than a salty liquid that we use to soak this meat in. I've flavored it with a number of different things, and let me walk you through this very, very quickly. I took water and I put it in a pot on the stove. I added salt, and I balanced the saltiness of that mixture with some sugar, just the same way bacon has salt and sugar in it. And then I added fennel, Pernod, which has the flavor of fennel in it, fennel seed, and fennel tops. And that's what I have here. Once it came up to a boil, I chilled it down, and when it's cold, it's ready to accept the meat that you want to brine. Now, how quickly does it take brine? Well, a thick 2 or 3 inch pork chop, I guess this is about a 2-inch pork chop, may take 2 full days to absorb the salt. But what happens little by little is that nature abhors unbalance. So with more salt on the outside and less salt on the inside, salty water will start to flow into the cells of the meat and it will become plump. it will gain about 10% in weight. Now, what does that mean to us? Well, the seasoning will go into the meat, so we get more flavor. The salt will inhibit the protein from clenching up so tightly when it cooks, so we'll have a piece of meat that is more tender. Because it has extra moisture in there, you can expect that this meat will be juicier, and I think all of us like juicy meat. And then finally, this meat, even before we cook it, will last longer because the salty environment is not friendly to bacteria. So I'm going to put this right into the brine, and that would have to soak for about 2 days. It should go into the refrigerator and stay nice and cold. What I have here are pork chops that have been brined for 24 hours. And if you take a look, I cut them a little bit thinner. They're about 1 inch thick, and 24 hours is more than enough time for them to absorb the proper amount of brine. I'm going to take it out and blot it dry. And we're going to cook this pork chop. No need to put salt on this because there's plenty of salt in our brine already, but if you do want to put a little bit of pepper on, I think that's fine. When you cook this, just be aware that there is sugar in the brine, and sugar likes to caramelize, so you have to regulate the heat a little bit more carefully. I've got a pan that's hot here. Let me turn it up a little bit. And in goes some canola oil. The way I'm going to cook this brined pork chop is start it on top of the stove. I'll brown it on one side, then I'll flip it over, and we'll put the whole pan in the oven. So you can imagine this sort of a mixed technique where we saute, flip it over, and pop it in the oven and get it off the stove. This is oftentimes what you will see happening in restaurants where they have to do a lot of work on the stovetop and they can't afford to cook things all the way. It also keeps the mess over there rather than out here. The pan is just starting to smoke, and so my pork chop goes into the pan. I'll turn the heat down just a little bit because I know that this has sugar in it. And when meat first hits a pan, if it's a little bit wet, it will stick, but as it begins to dry out, it will free itself. So don't fuss with it too soon. This pork chop is about 1 inch thick, and so I would say that it will take about 8 minutes to cook. I've got the oven set at about 450 degrees. It should be ready very, very quickly. Okay, you can see that we've got a little bit of browning there. That's the sugar. I'm going to take this and pop it into the oven. 8 minutes ago, this went into the oven, and now it's done. I'll show you a quick little trick. This is very popular in restaurants where you take just a piece of whole butter and a branch of thyme, and you add it to the hot pan. And as it cooks, you can baste this piece of meat with just a little bit of flavored butter. Sort of gilding the lily here a little bit. If we put the butter in early, obviously it would burn. But here at the end, it gives just a nice little freshness. All right, let's have a look at this pork chop. I'm going to serve this with some white beans that have herbs and a little bit of avocado, but I want to slice into it so that you can see that before I put it onto the plate. I'm going to cut it on the bias. And I want to give you a chance to see how juicy this meat is. The juiciness of this meat is really all about the brine. Now, It used to be that people would tell you that meat that was pork needed to be cooked well done. Otherwise, it wouldn't be good. But what you'll learn today is that you cook pork until it's about 145 degrees. And you can expect a little bit of pinkness in there. You'll also get a little bit of pink that comes from the brine itself. It sort of fixes pink color into the pork chop. Anyhow, I'm going to put this onto the plate. I'm going to start with the bone and then spread out all these slices. Oops, that's the end. All right, there's our brined pork chop, fennel brined pork chop. It's got a great flavor, but think about brining the next time you're cooking pork. It will make pork more flavorful, more forgiving in the pan, moister, more tender, and I think more delicious. You know, a prime rib of beef is probably the most expensive piece of meat you will ever buy. And wouldn't it be great if you had some confidence in understanding what makes it good and understanding how to cook it? That's what we're going to do right now. First thing I want to tell you is about grading of meat. I've got a bunch of different steaks here. Grading is a way of understanding quality in meat. And quality in meat, for the most part, has to do with how much intermuscular fat you will find in the meat. So if you look at these two steaks right here, this one is graded prime, and you can see that there's a lot of fat that makes its way through the muscle. This one here is graded select, and it doesn't have nearly the fat, the intermuscular fat that you see here. This beef fillet that I have back here is also graded USDA select. This is a beef fillet which never really has a lot of fat anyways, and it's always really tender. So I'm more inclined to buy a select beef fillet, just so that we're on the same page. At the top of the heap is prime. This is prime meat. And then we go one step removed to choice. And then down to select, and below select there's cutter and canner, which you don't oftentimes see on the market. So we have prime, we have select, this is select as well, and then over here is something called certified Angus beef, which is not a grade, but actually a brand. This is guaranteed to be the top 20% of choice, so prime and choice. They're looking for really good quality meat to be featured as certified Angus. Grading of meat is not mandatory. Grading of meat is a voluntary practice that costs money. So when people choose to grade meat, when packers choose to grade meat, typically they do it because they have something that they want to say to the world. Let me set this aside. Now, I called this a prime rib, but it is not prime meat. And I think that's an important consideration. You can find a prime graded prime rib, but we just tend to call this prime rib as a matter of course. This is the rib of the animal. This is this part of the animal, and it doesn't get a lot of exercise, so it eats very tender. If you look at the side, there's these kernels of fat that baste this meat as it cooks and keeps it really moist. What I've done is I've taken this meat off of the rib bones. There's the rib bones right there, and I cut it off of the rib bones. And then what I'm going to do is tie it back onto the ribs. So those ribs will act like a little rack. They'll also lend flavor to this meat, but it will be easier for me to deal with this later on. If you go to your butcher, you can ask them to do it for you. Now, what your butcher will do, and I'm going to do it right here, is they will tie the meat back onto the bone. So let me take care of that right now. And that piece of meat is ready to go into the oven, but for the fact that I haven't seasoned it yet. I don't need a rack in my roasting pan because it has the rack that is the bones. I'm going to season it pretty assertively with salt. This is a big piece of meat, so don't be shy. Sometimes I will add thyme to my mix. Other times I like to put garlic on. Some people like rosemary. But we're going to start with salt and pepper because I think that is the basic seasoning and the one that we should pay attention to right here. I'm going to pick up all this extra meat and the salt, and that is ready to go into the oven. It will cook with the hot air that circulates around it. I'm going to start it at a relatively high temperature and then turn it right down and roast it at about 350 degrees. A piece of meat like this will probably take about an hour and a half to an hour and 3/4. And by the time it comes out, it will have been in the oven long enough that it will be nice and brown. Okay, I've got the prime rib out of the oven. It cooked for about an hour and 3/4, and I took it out of the oven at an internal temperature of 125 degrees Fahrenheit. That's an important number. This is far too expensive a piece of meat to miss. So 125 degrees, I took it out of the oven, and I'm going to let it sit then for about a half an hour. What will happen initially is that the heat that's inherent in this piece of meat will have to dissipate. Some of it will pass off into the cool of the room, and some of it will carry on to the center of the meat and give it an extra 10 degrees or so of cooking. When you take the temperature on a piece of meat like this, make sure that the probe is not hitting a bone, because the bones will carry the heat of the oven into this meat much more effectively. Likewise, make sure it's not buried in a big piece of fat, but instead in the thickest part of the meat, in the center of the meat. All right, so this is rested now for about a half an hour, and I'm going to lift it up and transfer it over to the cutting board. What I would like to do is take all the strings off that I tied up earlier, and I'm going to pull all of those strings and we'll get them discarded. So I set those aside, and if you'll recall, I took this off the bone before it went into the oven. So what was our rack, the bones, separates very, very easily from the meat that I have here. Now, what I want to do is slice a little bit of this meat for you so we can see the quality of the job that we've done. There is a rib of beef. I have a second rib here that came out of the oven pretty quickly. It hasn't had much of an opportunity to rest yet. And so I'm going to carve this one as well. And likely what we will see is some of the juices will flow out of this meat because it hasn't had a chance to rest. Again, we'll take all the strings off and discard those. The bones can come off very, very easily. And you can see it's still steaming. And what I'm going to do is cut my first slice. And another. As you can see, the juices are just flowing out of this meat. I'm using my knife to collect them, but you can see them running down the knife and onto the board. If we all agree we like nice, juicy prime rib, then all of these juices are lost to us. You might take a piece of bread and mop them up off the board. That's the importance of letting meat rest. Okay, now, if you look here, I would say that's sort of medium rare going to medium. This is the same, but it already looks a little bit drier. If you like it more well done, what I would encourage is that you take your portion from the end cut. There's sort of a medium well cut. And then as you make your way to the middle, it will get progressively more and more rare. Let me just put together a real quick slice of meat, and I'll show you how I like to eat it. So for me, there's nothing better than roast beef with horseradish. Because this is such a large cut of meat, it's probably a good idea to season the cut surface with a little bit more salt and pepper, because that portion of the meat has never seen the light of the day until right now. If you prefer something a little bit more involved, if you look over in the pan here, there's plenty of pan juices to make a gravy or a jus. A jus would be not thickened with flour. A gravy would be thickened with flour. If you don't use this, if you choose to serve it with horseradish, make sure this is saved and you can use it in a soup at some point in the future. That's it, Roast Beef 101. I thought it would be fun to finish up with hamburgers and make a really good hamburger. I've got some ground beef laid out here. On this end, I've got only lean beef. There is no fat in this at all. The one right next to it has about 7% fat, 93% lean. The industry standard, I think, is about 20% fat, 80% lean. And then I'll talk about this in a second. Too much fat is a problem. Too little fat is a problem. The right amount of fat is where you want to be. Now, before I move on, recognize that ground beef presents a little bit of a hazard, and that is this, that bacteria is a surface phenomenon on a piece of meat. But if you take that meat and you grind it all up, then you mix the bacteria throughout the meat, it can be problematic if you don't take good care of it. So keep this refrigerated right up until you need it. I'm going to put some on the stove here. And we'll get those cooking. At this point, they haven't been seasoned, so I'm going to take care of that now. I think it's a nice idea not to season these too early, because salt can dry meat out over time. And then, of course, the rookie mistake when you're making hamburgers, if you're the guy in charge with the apron that says "Kiss the Cook," is you take your spatula and you just wail on this. You press on it really hard. The problem with that is each time you do, you're squeezing the juices out of this meat. So don't do that. Just relax. Take it easy. Maybe you noticed, and you can still see it here, that I made these burgers, or when I made these burgers and shaped them, I made them a little convex. So there's a little hollow in the top of each of them. The reason for that is that the meat will begin to contract when I start to cook it. And when it does, it may bunch up in the center and turn into a little meatball unless I begin with it slightly indented. And so I did that all the way along. As you'll recall, this is pure lean beef, about 7% fat, 20% fat, and way over here on the end, I took ground beef and I kneaded it and manipulated it, and I rolled it in a ball, and I flattened it, and I balled it up again. I did everything that you should not do when you're making a hamburger. You want to form this meat very, very loosely, not tight. And so we should see a difference right there. Now, when you're cooking hamburgers like this, there's a chance anyways that it will stick to the grill or to the pan, but as it cooks and that meat begins to shrink up, it typically frees itself. So if it doesn't want to move right away, don't force the issue. Just give it another minute or so, and when you come back to it, chances are it will have freed itself. As you can see, even this lean burger has already released itself from the grill, as has that one, as has that one. And what's interesting about this last burger that was over manipulated, it's already starting to shrink up. So if you look at it, it was the same size as the others, but now it's shrinking up. It's getting tighter and tighter, and that's because the meat was over manipulated. You can monitor the progress of this meat by looking at the side and see how far the heat has changed the color of the meat, or you can press on it. Obviously on this side we can see that it's raw. I'm going to take this and flip it over. We'll do the same there. The same there. And the same there. I'm going to turn the heat up just a little bit. And while these finish cooking, I want to talk about some condiments. One of the best things about hamburgers is that you have a lot of condiments readily available to you. You can choose from a million different kinds of cheese and bacon and sautéed mushrooms. And some people like to put a fried egg on top. Some people like tomatoes, others not, lettuce. So condiments I'm going to leave up to you. My particular favorite is blue cheese and bacon. Recognize that the bread of a hamburger is basically 2/3 of the equation, So if you can spend a little bit of extra money and get a really nice hamburger bun, I think that's money well spent. The condiments that I have here look pretty familiar. I'm looking at mustard, mayonnaise, and ketchup, but you may have some that you like. Things like barbecue sauce or chutney can make their way onto a hamburger. Back over here. This is much smaller and higher now. Our burger has shrunk up. These three that I didn't manipulate too terribly much have held their shape pretty nicely, and I think that's what you want. On the burger that I want to eat, which is the 80-20, I'm going to put a little bit of bacon on there. Maybe I'll put the bacon right onto the pan and let it warm up, and just crumble on some blue cheese and let that melt. So I can press this and decide if it's done. I want to cook this probably medium rare to medium. Some of this meat I ground myself, so I know that it's in good shape. At this point, I haven't seasoned the second side, so I'm going to take care of that right now. Remember that the Maillard reaction is where flavor comes from when you're cooking meat, and so don't be shy about letting this meat brown. All right, now that this bacon is hot, I'm going to put that on the top. And I'm going to turn this pan off. There's plenty of heat in this cast iron to carry these burgers all the way home. I'm going to give these one more turn. If you look at this burger over on the end, you can see that it's turning into a little meatball. It has been over-manipulated, and it shrinks up nice and tight. I don't think that's what you want. I want a burger that will fill out the entire size of the bun. All right. Let me build this really quickly. There's the bun. Condiments top and bottom. We'll set that aside. I like my lettuce on the bottom. And then my tomatoes. Those can be seasoned. There's no reason that they shouldn't be. This burger comes off the grill, and I slide it right on. And then I top it, and I'm going to move this right over here. I've got some French fries. What would a hamburger be without French fries? So I'll put those on the plate as well. And we'll move that right down here. Now, before we finish up, I want to come over here and just evaluate these hamburgers a little bit before we leave them. I'm going to move them onto the cutting board. This is lean. This is 7% fat. And this is 7% fat over-manipulated. So you can see that when this begins to shrink up, it takes a long time for the heat to get inside. It's almost as if it's protecting itself from the heat. So this is still almost raw on the inside. This burger cooked a lot more evenly. This one has about 7% fat. And I'm just going to taste it quickly. I didn't overcook it, but I'm here to tell you it tastes dry. So we'll set that aside. And this particular burger is cooked all the way through. This is the lean one. There is no fat in this at all. It's going to take me a second to recover from that. It's like the Sahara Desert in my mouth. Not just that it tastes dry in my mouth, but the flavor is very different. It tastes actually a little bit livery and not very pleasant. So, just a quick recap here. Don't over-manipulate the meat. Get good quality meat. If you can get it freshly ground, 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. About 20% fat is where you want to be. Too much and it'll all bleed out. Too little and the meat will taste dry. And even if you're concerned about your health, I would never, ever, ever ask for 100% lean ground beef because I can guarantee you, you'll be unhappy. Follow those rules and there's a good burger waiting for you at the end.